But I would like to acknowledge and pay respects to the Yagara people, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which I am today. And thank you, everyone. Simon and I will be sharing this presentation, so we'll be doing parts each and jump between them. Okay, so first of all, why are we looking at this study? Why are we looking at the question of open access policies in Australian universities? There's a couple of reasons. On the right-hand side of that slide, you'll see some work that's been done by the Koki project out of Curtin University, which is looking at how countries around the world are sort of faring in relation to both green and gold open access. And we're the kind of red blob down the bottom lower corner. So Oceania, which includes Australia, is comparatively stagnant in this area. There's also some work that's been done to show that more than 30% of the NH and MRC councils funded articles are not open access, even though there is a requirement that they should be. And we're aware that institutional policies and their requirements have an important role. So this is an attempt to provide a snapshot. Now, when we look at the Code of Conduct, which is put together by NH and MRC and Universities Australia and the Australian Research Council, that is the code by which we are held as researchers in Australia. And that makes quite clear that there is a responsibility for institutions to develop and maintain a suite of policies and procedures for this area. And so then you look at the two guidelines that come out of that relating to this. One's publication dissemination of research, which talks about institutions supporting researchers in this endeavour. So that might be by providing a repository, for example. And the thing that matters here is the management of data and information and research, which says research institutions have a responsibility to develop and implement policies. So that's what we're looking at. So the first question was, what do we mean when we say open access policy? So when we started, it sounded like a pretty simple thing. We'll just look at open access policies and analyse them. But then we realised we needed to actually define what we meant. So after much discussion, we've come up with the policy categorisation. So it has to be called an open access policy and be in the policy library. So that means sitting on a university, either in the policy library for the university or a university centralised site, not like a library page or a departmental page. It needs to refer to open access as part of its broader remit. So that's the categorisation. So that's the ones that we're looking at. The second options are policies that that are policies, but don't call themselves an open access policy. There might be a research policy or a publication policy. So they refer to open access, but they're not an open access policy per se. There's another categorisation, which is open access is referred to in, say, a guideline or a supporting document to another policy, or in some instances, there's no reference or documentation relating to open access at all. So the process we went through was we started with the AOASG website and checked raw map to find open access policies. And then where there were no open access policies we could see, we searched the university's website for policy to find the policy library. If there was no open access policy, we then used terms like academic integrity, research integrity, authorship, publication, peer review, those sorts of terms to try and identify a policy that might refer to this area. If there were none, then we would look for procedures and guidelines. And if there were none of those, we'd go back to the university website and search for the term open access. So the breakdown, and we've used the Study in Australia site to identify the 41 Australian universities we're talking about here, is that just under half, 20 universities have policies that are called an open access policy. There are a further 7 that mention open access but aren't open access policies. Further 6 that have principles, procedures or guidelines that refer to open access, and there's 8 that don't have any policies, procedures or guidelines that reference open access. So these are our universities that have open access policies. There's 20 of them and they're just listed there. So I'll pass over to Simon.
Hi everyone, so I'm talking from Wagga, so I'll start by acknowledging the Wiradjuri people of Australia, who are the traditional owners and custodians of this land. So the work we're talking to you about today is essentially a content analysis of these policies. And we actually did the analysis on all of the policies. So the specific OA policies and these other policies that discuss OA, and also the guidelines and procedures and so on. So we've done the analysis on all of that, but today we're just going to talk specifically about the 20 open access policies, because that's obviously a more focused, sort of comparable corpus, if you like, to talk about. So the analysis was done by the whole team. We sort of split the policies up and all looked at them. There was some sort of cross-checking to ensure sort of reliability and consistency in our analysis and so on. And the dimensions of the analysis, some of these we borrowed from places like RawMap or other work that's been done on OA policies. And some of these dimensions are things that emerged through our reading and discussion of the policies, points that looked interesting. Now, the grey ones are things we looked at that we're not going to have time to talk about today, but all the black ones are the kind of dimensions that we're going to cover briefly in the next few slides. Okay, so the first thing we looked at was the definition of OA. Why is that important? Well, open access, as we all know, it's a complex space. There's different terminology involved. There's perhaps no sort of consensus or no widespread understanding on exactly what it means. We can't assume that all researchers to whom the policy applies will have a rich, in-depth understanding of open access as a concept. And obviously, it's good policy practice to define the key terms around which your policy applies. So we looked at the different definitions that were contained within these policy documents. Now, before we look at what exactly the definitions, how they broke down among these policies, it's worth noting that there are some sort of widely established common OA definitions. There's these, we might call them sort of international definitions, long-standing, very formative, important definitions like Budapest and the Berlin Declaration. There's also a series of Australian-based definitions. The ARC and NHMRC are obviously highly relevant here, and there's the AOASG definition as well. So we assumed that in sort of developing the definitions for these policies, people drafting the policies might well be drawing on these different ideas from these established definitions. And in fact, that's what we found. So we've essentially looked at each definition and tried to match it up with what existing definitions there were. And for the most part, these definitions covered the key aspects from those definitions, but only two reference the source of those definitions. And I think it's worth pointing out as well that many of these definitions use sort of simplified language. And they're talking about open access, purely focusing on the kind of access side of things without necessarily talking about potentially more complex things like licensing and attribution and so on. So we also looked at the role of the library and the mentions of funders within these policies. The vast majority of policies did sort of specify a role for the library, either in governance or delivery of this policy. Interestingly, though, a quarter didn't mention the library. So there's interesting difference there in the extent to which the library is integral or not to the realization of these policies. Where the library role was specified, around half of the policies specified that library role in the terms of a kind of repository management role, also help in terms of assistance, advice about interpretation of the policy, and particularly around copyright compliance. And then the vast majority of policies also discussed or explicitly referenced funders. So 17 of the 20 policies mentioned the ARC or NHMRC. And in most cases, this was to sort of confirm compliance. So this policy ensures that the university and researchers comply with these ARC or NHMRC policies. So now I guess we're looking a little bit more in detail now at the language of the policies. So we were kind of interested in the terms, the verbs or the language used to frame the responsibility or the requirements of the policy, what researchers need to do. And you can see a breakdown of these keywords here. 6 of the policies were framed around the word must. So full text research outputs must be made openly available where. And we'll see there's some variation here: must and will and requirement, responsibility, mandates, should be. So there is some, we can get into sort of discourse analysis discussion of what the strength of these different terms are. But it's interesting that there is some variation. And the other interesting point here is this difference between policies that take an active voice and a passive voice. So the active voice, researchers will deposit their blah, blah, blah. An active voice, the passive voice is more like research outputs will be. And I think we can argue potentially around whether good policy language is more active or passive.
So then we looked at the question of depositing time, whether or not there was some sort of requirement or definition of the time frame around publication or otherwise about when the deposit should occur. And only 13 of the 20 policies specified a time frame by which the open access version should be deposited in the repository or made available. And in some cases, more than one time frame was specified. Now, there's not 13 examples here, but you can see that the range of examples of the kind of language used. So within 3 months of publication, or within 12 months of publication, or as soon as possible, or no greater than 12 months from date of publication, and so on. Now, there is actually a distinction here between the timing of deposit versus when it's openly accessible. These are the same quotes or the same sections from the policies, but the ones that are highlighted yellow are the ones that are referring about when the item should be deposited into the repository, whereas the other ones are talking about when the item should be openly accessible. And there is a clear distinction between those. And there's a complication which we're not going to go into a great detail here, but one which I've got a deep understanding of from working in the UK context where things are required to be deposited on acceptance. There are 2 universities that do specify upon acceptance. One's QUT and the other one's the Australian Catholic University. Now, in both cases, they actually do have systems in place that can manage that. There's a whole different workflow that needs to exist if you're going to take material prior to publication. So it's worth noting they have put that in place.
Call myself on mute again. It was bound to happen once. The other thing we looked at is the exceptions to OA requirements, and all policies, as you would expect, specified some exceptions to the general requirements to make research outputs available in some form of open access. Now, as you would expect, the majority of these, most policies, in fact, all policies, I think, to some extent, discuss or specify publisher agreements, copyright or licensing restrictions, these as kind of key exceptions. So make it open access unless you can't, basically. There are some other interesting reasons there as well, like cultural sensitivity, privacy and royalties and so on. But for the most part, the exceptions come down to what publishers are, the kind of agreements that authors have with publishers for the publication. And so there, this is just to illustrate those. What we captured here was the specific language in the policy. So I think there's a good argument that publisher agreement and copyright and licensing and restrictions are essentially equivalent. It's just this is the capturing of this kind of 2 schools of how to present this within the policy. And there's some interesting exceptions. So I mean, this I think talks to the complexity around this. So one policy talked about an exception was a publisher version of non-OA publication. So what we might think of as the version of record. And this is just, as you all know, introducing these further complexities around the different versions of outputs and how the researchers to whom these policies apply are supposed to kind of navigate this landscape, understand these distinctions between the different versions of their work. So a key thing that we were interested in as well was, okay, so we have these policies. Well, how do they have teeth? What happens if you breach this policy or you don't follow the requirements of the policy? And only 3 of the OA policies we looked at actually explicitly mentioned what happens if you fail to comply. We noticed too that there's a sort of ambivalence here. The university may do this. It's on the weaker side of trying to enforce compliance. I guess it's a slightly complicated place because there's a good argument, I think, that that could be made that employees of a university are kind of bound by all the policies. So maybe you don't need to put the consequences in each individual policy. But it's an interesting debate, particularly around the kind of impact of these policies.
So one of the things we were interested in looking at was the question of whether or not the policies determined or said anything about payment for publication. This, of course, matters because, as I'm sure this audience is aware, if you're paying for publication for an article in a hybrid journal where there is already a subscription cost to that journal, so you're paying for that particular article to be made open access, then that's double dipping. It's paying twice. And so there are some positions that say we shouldn't be doing that. So that's what we were looking at. And so the across the top of this graph are the 9 institutions that do say something about payment for publication, and down on the the left-hand side is the various sort of categories that came up in those areas. Now, this is quite a complex graph, and we realise that. So we've actually written a blog that is online, and we've tweeted out the slides to these slides, but also this link to the blog to the Twitter handle for the conference, so you should be able to find it. But what you will notice is that there are some inconsistencies. So Australian National University does not support hybrid. Yes, it says that, but there is an implication that it doesn't support gold open access. I think that's unintentional. It's just some of the way the wording has occurred. So it comes back to this question of language.
Okay, so that was a very quick fast forward run through of the findings. It's turned into a much bigger study than I think we were anticipating to begin with. And what we've tried, I think, to try and get across in this talk is just, it's a messy space. And that's really what struck all of us as we've tried to do this, tried to look for, I think we were expecting there to be a bit more consistency, a kind of clearer message about what open access means in universities in Australia. But what we found was that there's significant, meaningful differences in terms of how key terms are defined, what responsibilities are put upon different actors, what role the library plays, how compliance is monitored and measured, and what the consequences for failure to comply is, different exceptions, different alignment with funder policies, different perspectives on paying to publish. So, you know, there's a lot more to do here. I think it'd be interesting to hear some discussion or comments on this, because we're very keen to sort of understand better what people within institutions feel about these policies. But it's also kind of raised, we think, some further questions. And something we've discussed a lot while we're doing this is trying to get a feel for what's the intent of these policies. In some cases, we get a sense the intent is to sort of align somewhat with ARC or NHMRC policies. In some, there's more of a kind of OA advocacy. There's more of a leadership role that seems to be emerging in these policies. But how are they designed? How are they developed and written and maintained? And then, crucially, to what extent are researchers aware of their responsibilities under their policies? Is there a link between different types of policies and OA uptake? And if so, what are the aspects of the policy that are the leveraging factors? What are the key drivers within policies of OA adoption? So that's it, that's the team. And a few, I think Hamid is online as well, and maybe Mariam, but we're very happy to take any questions you might have, and thanks a lot for listening.
What is holding back open access in Australia? Do funders and institutions need to be harder on compliance? Does the system need more funds to support gold or transformative OA? So
if the question is what needs to happen to make open access more prevalent here, I think that the thing that is really, frankly, missing is leadership. And so what we're talking about today here is open access policies within institutions, and that's important because at the moment the sort of centralised aspect of the National Health and Medical Research Council and the Australian Research Council and Universities Australia through the Code of Conduct are devolving that responsibility to the institutions. But you can look at the successful countries like the UK and the Netherlands, which have got over 75% open access, and they brought in strong national policies in 2013. So sort of nearly 8 years ago. So these sorts of things take a very long time. And even if we did that tomorrow, it's going to take a few years for it to to get into effect. So that's my response. We need leadership.
Yeah, and I would agree, and I would add to that the, you know, as a researcher, I'm well aware among colleagues here who don't work in the open access space that the different drivers of choice around where to publish and responsibilities about depositing repositories and so on. The main driver of academic behavior is obviously the incentives around career and promotion, and in most cases these are the things driving behavior in researchers. And so policy developments really do need to have teeth, and they need time to change culture. Danny made a great point. You know, it's 2013 that these things started to come in the UK, and it takes that amount of time for change to become normalized, for different practices to become part of an academic's publishing workflow. So there isn't going to be a click your fingers overnight transformation, which is why it's all the more important that these changes start happening soon.
Moving on quickly, because I think we've only got a couple of minutes left. Did you get a sense that part of the messiness was around who owns the issue of policy sponsorship or development?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, actually, because we did note as part of our gigantic spreadsheet that emerged from this project, we did note who the kind of responsible officers and who the various contacts were. In most cases, it was related to the library, but in others, it's to do with in kind of research offices and senior people within that research offices. I think an extension of this might be to look if that difference actually leads to any kind of difference in policy. That's not work we've done yet. I do know, you know, some people in the project team have been involved, obviously, in the development of policies, and they've talked to us about the politics and complexities around, you know, meeting different stakeholder needs within each individual unique political environment in universities. So my sense is that the messiness is to do with the realization or the compromises made internally to get these documents finished, and also to do with sort of a lack of a kind of general community awareness about what these policies are intended to do and how they should be framed.